Hey guys, I'm Jessie, and today we are going to be talking about some of my personal favorite adult fantasy and sci-fi books. It was honestly really hard to narrow this down because there's so many of them where it's like a specific author and I love every single one of their books, but I didn't want to put like 6 Brandon Sanderson books and 5 V.E. Schwab books and all the Sarah Beth Durst books. So I picked out like one of each. But no, if it's like Sarah Beth Durst or V.E. Schwab, Brandon Sanderson, like all the books, just all of them. But these are like some of my top favorites and ones that I think would be good for you to read. Ones that I would recommend to pretty much anyone that reads fantasy or some sci-fi. So we're just gonna jump in and start talking about some of these books. First and foremost, we have The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This is an Asian-inspired historical fiction fantasy, and it's great, y'all. This is a very violent, almost grim, dark fantasy world that is based on like Chinese history. There was a lot of, cost of war going on in here, and there was a lot of like actual historical research that went into specifically one chapter that I can think of off the top of my head. So if you do pick this up, just know that there is probably a content warning for everything, and I mean everything. There is one chapter in particular that shows the atrocities of war. And this chapter was literally pulled from the history books. It was literally pulled from Chinese history. If you know anything about the Rape of Nanjing, I did not until I read this and then did research. So look into that if you're interested in reading this, because I found that one chapter very difficult to read, especially knowing that these atrocities really happened in real history and they are not something that like R.F. Kuang made up off the top of her head. But we are following this main girl named Ren, and she is like a young, poor war orphan, and she's like in this home where like she's not really treated the best. She's about to be basically sold off to marry this older man so her like foster family can kind of get rid of her. She decides nah, and she's gonna like study really hard and get into this like really high caliber like military school. And from there we kind of follow her journey towards like claiming her power and trying to fight this army that's attacking them and attacking everything that they know and just killing people and like mass genocide. And it's so good. And we get some really cool magic, like very cost of magic, very much like we get magic from the gods, but the gods are not nice. They're not like cool, friendly, chill. They're vicious. And when you take on the power of one of these gods and it gives you magic, you're slowly losing your own sanity until you are no longer yourself. And I just love this series. So this is one that I highly recommend you pick up. The next book that we have is Shadow of the Gods by Zhang Gwen. This is the first book in his newest series. I think it's the Borne saga, I think. Either way, this book is fantastic. I was not a big fan of Faithful and the Fallen. I only read the first book, really didn't care to continue. Picked this up and loved it. So if you maybe read Malice or Faithful and the Fallen and weren't a massive fan of it, I still recommend you try this out. Even if you liked Faithful and the Fallen, check this out, because I know a lot of people who love both of his series. I mean, there's a dragon god. Honestly, don't go in expecting there to be like this dragon god throughout the whole book though. Like it comes in pretty late, just an FYI. But one of my favorite things is one of our main perspectives is a middle-aged mother who is on a campaign to save her son. And she goes all kinds of batshit crazy and just like badass warrior mom. And I love her. She is the best. We also have some other really cool characters. We're following like this like a troop of like mercenaries. And then we're following this like one guy who like escapes from slavery and like joins the group of mercenaries, and I love it. And like all 3 stories kind of come together at the end, and So good. I cannot wait for book 2. Like, I want book 2 in this series because I loved it so much, and I think you will too. Next up, we have Brandon Sanderson. I already told you at the beginning, we are only going to be talking about one book per author, and it was very, very difficult for me to pick a singular Brandon Sanderson book when I have loved them all. I loved Elantris, I loved Warbreaker, I really loved the Mistborn series, but today we are going to talk about and recommend Way of Kings Book 1 in the Stormlight Archives. This book, she's a chunky chunks, like, and they just keep getting bigger. I'm reading Oathbringer now, and whoo, like, this is my whole TBR. It is massive, but it is so good. And don't be intimidated by how massive it is. Like, I was. But it's super easy to digest. Like, Brandon Sanderson's writing style, in my opinion, is very easy to read, easy to digest. It's not overly flowery, it's not overly explanatory, but you still get this amazing world building and fantastic characters, and you really feel connected to these characters. They're multi-dimensional, and it's so hard to describe what this book is about. Like, I have read, you know, the first 2 and part of the 3rd one, and I'm still like, what is this series about? How do you explain it? So, the short of it is you got a bunch of characters and they all kind of come together. At some point, their paths collide. When we start in this book, they're all separate. But the overarching theme is that there's this war going on with these people called the Parshindi and the humans. And they're on this, like, big plains, and it's called the Shattered Plains. And it's, like, got, like, hills and divots and chasms, and there's, like, these giant creatures that they kill for their gem hearts. And, you know, we're following one person that's like a kind of like a general in the war, like really high standing, high class in the society. He's like the brother to the former king. We're also following a girl who's like kind of a noble, but she's like a lower end noble. And she's trying to like save her family from all this debt that they're in because of her dad. And then we're following a former soldier turned slave, as he has just been kind of kicked and beaten down, and then all their paths kind of collide, and it is fantastic. And I know I did a terrible job of explaining this book, but if you've read this, you know that this is a very difficult book to explain because there's a lot going on. A lot. But I love it. And I think that if you are already a fantasy reader and want to read it, then this is definitely the Brandon Sanderson to go with. Next up, we have one of my absolute favorite standalone adult fantasy books. And that is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This book is just beautiful. It is lyrical and flowery and poetic, and it's set in a library, and then there's like this like secret path that they take, and they get to this like secret underground library basically, and it's so good. And just go into it knowing you're going to be confused the entire time, because there's like a story within a story, and we're basically following this kid named Zach, and he is a college student, and he goes to the library. He ends up finding a book that is unmarked, nobody knows what it is. He starts reading it, and there's a story about him in his childhood in this like anthology collection book, and he's like super confused. So he goes on this kind of quest to try to figure it out, and when trying to figure it out, he finds out about this like secret societies and this like secret library, and then we're still getting like side snippets of different stories, and at some point the stories all start to make sense and like collide, and you're like, oh. But this is definitely one to just go into knowing you're going to be kind of confused until the end, and then it might need a reread. Because honestly, I think this book was made for rereading, because you catch things that you didn't catch the first time, especially within like the many stories within the story. But it's beautiful. I love Erin Morgenstern's writing. She is just very lyrical and whimsical, and this is beautiful. Another one with like a super unique writing style is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This is the first book in the Broken Earth trilogy. Y'all, the first page of this book had me crying. Okay? That's all you need to know. We are following a couple different characters. One of our main characters is a middle-aged mother. Love that for me. And we're following her as she's trying to like save her daughter from her husband who had just killed their son. And we are also in this like very unforgiving world that's in the middle of what they call a 5th season, which is a post-apocalyptic or an apocalyptic event. And, you know, so everything is shutting down, everyone's boarding up, and she's trying her best to find her daughter. We're also following another girl who's like a 6-7-year-old, and she's kind of on this journey to this like citadel where they train the people that use magic in this world. And the people that use magic in this world are not revered. They are basically enslaved. They are like really looked down upon. If you find one in the wild that's not like being controlled by like the government, then like it's your job to turn them in, and they're either like taken or like murdered or whatever. And then we're also following a third character who is like a 20-ish year old woman, and she is one of these magic users as well. But she's kind of on this like apprenticeship journey with this older man, and they are trying to like help people by like quelling earthquakes and things like that, because in this world it's like an earth magic. They call them orogenies. They can control, you know, the quakes of the earth and lava and ice, and it's so good. And then of course we see where our 3 stories converge and like why we're being told 3 different stories. But honestly, this is another one to just go into knowing not much and knowing you're going to be confused. And remember, one of these perspectives is second person, which is really jarring at first. Like I even found it really jarring, and usually like perspectives don't bother me, first, third, whatever. Second person's a little weird to read in, but in this context, I think it worked so well. It was just so well done. The fact that like the 1 chapters with the mother were written in a third person or second person perspective just made it hit home so much more for me. Highly recommend you pick this one up. Next up, we have Queen of Blood by Sarah Beth Durst. I absolutely love this. Again, it was really hard for me to pick just one Sarah Beth Durst books because I love them all. I love The Bone Maker. I love Race the Sands. Like, all of her books are so good. But this is one of her only like series. So the other 2, Race the Sands and Bone Maker, they are standalones. This is the first book in the Queens of Renthia series, so I figured I would talk about this one. And this is a really cool world as well. We're in this place called Renthia, and we're more specifically in Arteray, which is this like really woodsy, foresty type place, and like everybody lives in the trees, but like the spirits, like earth spirits, water spirits, like they're out to kill you. They're not friendly, and the women in this world, some of them have magic and they can like control the spirits. Not super well, but they can. And any woman in Arteray that is found to have the ability to control the spirits can go to this school and like learn their powers more, and then potentially become what they call an heir to the throne, and then potentially become the queen. Well, because the queen, it's not like birth succession, it's somebody who's chosen basically out of these women with power, and they kind of take on this mass amount of power so they can control all the spirits and keep them from killing everybody. And we're following our girl Delina, who we start out with as a child, and kind of as she grows up and goes to this school, and like things that happen to her, friends that she meets, and it's so good. Book 2 is actually my favorite in the series because we get the perspective of a middle-aged mom, which, y'all, that's my thing. Definitely recommend picking up this series. Next up, we have Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. This is another series where we're following aging individuals, only these are men, and we are following some old dudes in like their like 40s and 50s as they like get the band back together for one more tour to save the daughter of one of the band members. And it's hysterical. This is like just comedy gold, and it's got so many Dungeons and Dragons and like classic rock references. So like basically your mercenary bands, which these guys are like your rock stars of this world, right? And they go on tour and kill monsters and stuff like that. And this band was like at one point the most famous band in the world. Think like your Led Zeppelins, your Rolling Stones, you know? And now they're old, creaky old men with bad backs and knees, and they're going to get the band back together one more time because one of the guy's daughters is in peril. And it's fantastic. Next up, we have Vicious by V.E. Schwab. Again, this is one of the ones where it was like harder for me to choose one V.E. Schwab book. I love Addie LaRue. I love the Darker Shade series, but Vicious is probably my favorite of all of her books. And this can be read as a standalone. It is currently a duology, but she is working on a third book. But you're not gonna be like upset, like, oh my god, I don't have book 3, like, because the way they end is they could be read standalone, it could be read as a duology, and then the trilogy, you're like, oh cool, that's gonna happen. So basically in this book, we're following two characters, Victor and Eli. Both of them are like college best friends, and they are working on their thesis about extraordinary people. So basically people with superpowers, like your X-Men type people, right? They figure out that you have to have a near-death experience in order to like get powers. So they decide to experiment on themselves and see if they can give themselves some powers. That is in the past. We're also jump forward 10 years in the future from that incident, and we've got like Victor in jail and Eli out doing some crazy Eli vigilante stuff, and you're like, man, how did we get to best friends to hating each other to where did he go to prison? Why is Eli doing this? And it's a very choppy timeline. So it's like we start and then back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, which honestly I think makes it like very interesting to read because it is not a linear timeline. It's 10 years in the past, 10 years in the future, 5 years in the past, 5 years in the future, 4 years, like it goes back and forth until eventually it collides near the end. And it is just amazing. Highly recommend this one. And then the last book on this list is the only like true sci-fi book on this list. Vicious could be seen as like kind of a sci-fi because it's like superhero, anti-hero, but this is the only true like sci-fi book on this list, and that is Borne by Jeff Vandermeer. This is a standalone adult sci-fi. It is weird sci-fi. If you've ever read anything by Jeff Vandermeer, you know he's a weird writer. That is his whole genre, is weird sci-fi, and I love this. We're following Rachel, who is this kind of like middle-aged woman who like kind of scavenges for a living, and it's this like very post-apocalyptic world where this company called The Company has like basically destroyed everything. There is a giant flying bear who terrorizes this city, and then his little baby bears monstrosities that like also terrorize the city on his behalf. And she goes out scavenging one day and she finds this blob that she thinks is a sea urchin and brings it home with her, and her boyfriend's like, WTF is that? And she's like, I thought it was kind of cool, it's like a plant. Well, this plant continues growing and gains sentience and becomes a thing that she calls Borne, and she ends up kind of mothering it, and it's a really, really weird story, but it's so good. I love it. And if you want like badass women in their middle age, like, you got this. You got this. Definitely recommend this one. Alright, well, those are all of the adult fantasy and one sci-fi books that I recommend that you try out if you like reading adult fantasy and sci-fi. Let me know what you think about any of these books, if you plan to pick up any of these books. I would love to hear it, love to talk to you about them, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!